Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Alliance Against Violence Adversity, or AVA's, webinar series, which we call Webinar Wednesdays. The title Webinar Wednesday comes because we host an awesome and important webinar pretty much every Wednesday, so keep an eye out for those. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Yersich. With AVA, I'm an early career researcher and the webinar series lead, along with my colleagues Jason and Andrea. Outside of that, I'm also the co-director of the Frida Center for Research on Violence Against Women and Children and faculty in the Sociology and Criminology Department at Capilano University. Just a couple of quick procedural things before we begin. This webinar is being recorded. It will be posted up to our YouTube channel, so if you want to share this information with anyone or rewatch the webinar, it will be there for you within the next few days, I believe. And throughout the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A function to pose any questions you have for our two awesome speakers today. And at the end, the speakers and I will make some time to have a conversation and answer those questions. Now, on a national level, we encourage all Canadians and visitors to Canada to learn about the Indigenous peoples of the lands on which they live, work, and visit, and become engaged allies together. We, as Canadians, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, respect the self-determinations of First Nation, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and their rights and responsibilities in culture, languages, and the pursuit of wellness. Now, for today's webinar, the title is Understanding Sexual Assault, Child Sexual Abuse, and Responding to Disclosures. And we are joined by Kira Snodgrass and Mary Valenzuela of the Calgary Communities Against Sexual Abuse, or with an acronym, CCASA. Kira is a sexual violence educator at CCASA. She has a diploma in child, youth, and care from Lethbridge College and a bachelor in health sciences and addictions and counseling from the University of Lethbridge. Having always had the desire to work with those impacted by sexual violence, Kira's passion for the work deepened when she began working as a sexual violence support counselor in Lethbridge. Upon her relocation to Calgary, she was excited to join CCASA with the same role. Her frontline experience on both the Lethbridge and Calgary sexual assault response teams has given her a unique perspective and understanding of the various levels of impact sexual violence can have. Her co-speaker, Mary, is a sexual violence educator with CCASA. Mary's background is in sociology and women's and gender studies. She has been a sexual violence educator at CCASA for over a year and has been a program facilitator for various nonprofit organizations across the city for over 6 years. Mary's work as a sexual violence educator has amplified her passion for providing safe spaces for people to share their story and diverse experiences without fear of judgment, as well as have conversations on difficult but extremely important topics. Kira, Mary, thank you for joining us today. I'm very excited for your talk, and I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having us. So to start, we will just go right into it and begin exploring our group agreement. So again, this, because of the webinar format, does look a little bit different when we're talking about how we can create a safe space together to have these conversations. But especially when it does come to questions that come through the Q&A feature, it is important to note that once we hit answer, that question will move over to a public spot where folks can see each other's names. So privacy is a very important thing. Thankfully, with Zoom, they do have a feature where you can ask a question anonymously. So if you're not wanting your name attached to that, please check that off when you're submitting a question. Next, learning can really happen in places of discomfort. This is an uncomfortable topic. It's difficult to talk about, but it's an important thing to talk about. So we do encourage people to lean into that discomfort, but also know maybe when you shouldn't lean into that and you maybe need a break to take care of yourself. Accountability is an important thing. A lot of the time we intend to say one thing, but we say a different thing, or maybe we don't recognize the impact of something we ask or say. So just being able to own that and allowing everyone to ask in questions and engage in being able to have that, because we do technically have limited time for questions, so we want to make sure that everyone is able to ask their questions. So, what we'll be talking about today, it will be a very busy time of going through some content because we have a lot to cover. But we'll be talking about sexual assault, sexual harassment, and child sexual abuse definitions. We'll discuss age of consent in Canada and what is called close in age exemption laws as well. We'll talk about some misconceptions and some facts about sexual violence. We'll talk about how children disclose child sexual abuse. We'll talk about reporting overall, as well as a bit of an overview of impacts of sexual violence and how we can provide support. We'll also talk about a couple different resources and the support services that we offer here at CASA. Okay, folks, so I feel like I've already said the term sexual violence a lot. So for those of you who don't know, we do use sexual violence as an umbrella term because it encompasses any act of sexual violence. So some of these are include but are not limited to child sexual abuse, sexual assault or rape, sexual harassment, stalking, indecent exposure, degrading sexual imagery, voyeurism, cyber harassment, intimate partner sexual violence, sexual exploitation, and trafficking. What I will note as well is that things like degrading sexual imagery and voyeurism can be done consensually, but in this context, if we do refer to those, it is in a non-consensual context, meaning that's why it would be under that sexual violence umbrella. Okay, so when we are talking about sexual violence as a whole, we really like to preface with language. And as you can see here, we have we have three different color codings for different terms. So when we're first looking at this, we see victim and survivor. Now, at CASA and at other sexual assault centers throughout the province, we really do focus on person first language because we kind of try to steer away from labeling someone else's experience. So, for example, if we refer to someone as a survivor, that might just feel like it doesn't fit for them. They might not feel like they're surviving. When we think of the term survivor, we think of like someone pushing through something, overcoming something. For some people, that just doesn't necessarily fit. And when we think of the term victim, a lot of people associate that term with like struggling or feelings of weakness or disempowerment. And that doesn't fit for folks sometimes either. Or sometimes these words might actually fit for them. And if they use that language for themselves, we can totally use that language back. But for others, it might just feel like they're being labeled or even identified by something that happened to them, not something that they chose, right? I know when I first started in the sexual violence field, think about 5 years ago, survivor was just the term we used. That's what was accepted, and that's what we were supposed to use. So we do see that there's been kind of some evolving with language and the way we go about it, but the main focus really being that person first language. We might even see people now who refer to themselves as victim or survivor, and that's great. We can totally echo that, and we can use that same language, but we just want to focus on that person first. So you'll hear Mary and I say the person who experienced harm, person who experienced sexual violence. And that's not just to talk in a roundabout way, but to really, really be able to allow people to identify themselves, but also to not label them based on an experience that happened to them, because that's not who they are. It's something that happened. Um, as you can see, the next one in the pink is offender, perpetrator, parent, relative, friend, someone we know. These are different terms to refer to someone who chose to use sexual violence to cause harm. Offender and perpetrator or like bad guy are really common terms that we hear. But what's important to note, and we will talk about this a bit more into the presentation, is it is typically someone who's known to the individual that chooses to use sexual violence to harm them. And sometimes we can create what I refer to as a barrier to support by labeling the person who caused harm. Because a lot of the time, if it's a parent, a relative, a friend, or someone they know, they might have care and love for that person, but that person caused them harm. And that's a very complex thing to unpack and understand. And so if we right away are saying, well, that person's an offender or they're a bad guy because they did this to you, that can create a barrier to support because, again, it's such a confusing thing to unpack for that individual who experienced it. So if they're feeling defensive of that person at all, because they might still have connection to that person, they might still love and trust them in other ways, and that can just create a barrier to support. So again, if they refer to the person as a bad guy, as really any term, we can use that. If they refer to them as their friend or their partner, or if they refer to them by name, we can totally use those terms. But again, just trying to use that person first language so that we're not labeling them and inadvertently creating a barrier to support by, again, assigning that label and potentially inciting a level of defensiveness. Next, we see that we have the words in purple. And what you'll notice is that a lot of these are things that are referred to under that sexual violence umbrella. So we have the term sexual violence, intimate partner sexual violence or domestic violence, sexual harassment, child sexual abuse, sexual assault, stalking, weapon of war, rape. Um, all these terms are common things that folks experience under that sexual violence umbrella. And again, you'll hear us use the term sexual violence a lot because it encompasses all these different things that folks may experience. But when it does come to someone maybe sharing an experience with us, it can be difficult or maybe damaging for us to right away be like, oh, that was sexual assault. You were sexually assaulted, right? That can be very jarring for someone to hear, especially if maybe they viewed it as an uncomfortable experience, not quite sure like what happened. It feels very confusing. It's difficult to unpack, and we are right away labeling it as sexual assault. That can be a lot. Or especially with something like intimate partner sexual violence. If someone is sharing with us something they experience with an intimate partner and we right away slap a label on it, it can incite that defensiveness as well. But it can also just almost be traumatic, right? If we experience something difficult and all of a sudden someone's telling us it's this really big thing that's difficult to unpack, but also people might just have different ways of talking about it. Someone may feel like they didn't experience intimate partner sexual violence, but they were sexually assaulted by their partner. Maybe someone uses the term rape to describe their experience, and rape truly is a little bit more of a term that we see in media, we see in the US because that is within their laws. In Canada, we refer to it as sexual assault because rape does typically imply penetration, and we know that doesn't always exist within sexual assaults that occur. So that's usually why we use the term sexual assault. But if we are supporting someone and they refer to their experience as rape, we'll mirror that language because in sexual violence, folks unfortunately feel a lack of autonomy that's taken away by someone, and being able to just really reinforce the language they want to use to define their experience can be very impactful and empowering. So it's just important that we focus on that language. We try to use more neutral person first language. But then, of course, if they are using certain terms or labels for themselves or their experience or for the person who caused harm, we can echo those too. And that is actually a great level of support. Okay, so I know I've said sexual assault a few times already. So to provide a bit of a definition, we would call sexual assault any unwanted sexual act done by a person or persons to another, or sexual activity without a person's consent or voluntary agreement. Um, I know that that definition seems a little bit broad, and that's because it is a broad thing. If we have a very narrow definition, it actually leaves out a lot of different experiences that some folks have that would still qualify as sexual assault. So that is why it's a bit more broad, but we'll be able to provide more context to this as we move throughout the presentation. So for sexual harassment is defined as any unwanted sexual comments or behaviors, including unwanted sexual attention to somebody's appearance, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, or sexual activity. Overall, sexual harassment is just things that makes us feel embarrassed, uncomfortable, or unsafe. And a lot of the time, people will say, oh, it was just flirting. Flirting doesn't make us feel embarrassed, uncomfortable, or unsafe. And that is one of those really key pieces to understand when it comes to sexual harassment. Okay, well, as we look at sexual assault and sexual harassment in a legal context, what we do know about both of them is that both are non-consensual. But sexual assault includes physical contact of a sexual nature. And as we know, sexual assault is included in the Criminal Code of Canada. Whereas with sexual harassment, it is usually verbal, visual, written, or the physical contact is non-sexual contact, so not touching of any private parts. One thing I will note that a lot of folks either don't know or just don't really think of. When we think of private parts, we think of the usual ones, but our mouth is also a private part. So that is an important thing to note as well. Sexual harassment is not included in the Criminal Code of Canada unless it develops into stalking or criminal harassment. One thing I will note, since Mary and I and CASA are in Calgary, is that Calgary is one of the cities, and I feel like Toronto may be the other, and potentially Vancouver, but there are some cities in Canada that have a harassment bylaw. And that's not just sexual harassment, that's any form of harassment, meaning that if someone does experience harassment within the city of Calgary, they can report that, and the person who was using that harassment behavior can receive a fine. So while that doesn't really always make it feel better that it's not in the criminal code itself, it is a good step in that direction to at least be able to have that option to report it again within the cities that have that bylaw. Okay, so as we talk about sexual assault laws, there are a couple different things to know. When we're talking about these, you can see they're labeled as level 1, 2, and 3. This is really just to talk about the way that it reflects in the Criminal Code of Canada. So the level of which someone can be charged with it. So they kind of talk about the degree of physical violence or threats to someone used. But what is important to note is that this isn't to describe a hierarchy of impact. Any of these levels of sexual assault are impactful in their own ways, and they impact folks differently, but it's really just to help us understand the different degrees of sexual assault and what those charges may be reflected as. So when we look at our first one here, sexual assault occurs if a person is kissed, sexually touched, or forced to engage in intercourse or any other sexual activity without consent. Level 2 is described as sexual assault with a weapon, threats to a third party, causes bodily harm, or sexual assault committed by more than one person. And then third, we have aggravated sexual assault, which occurs if a person is wounded, maimed, disfigured, or beaten, or in danger of losing their life while being sexually assaulted. Now, what is important to note, folks, is I feel like on like TV, movies, media, we usually see level 1 or no, sorry, level 2 or level 3. Those are actually not as common. Level 1 is actually the most common, and that's why a lot of the time we see folks questioning if their experience was valid in terms of experiencing sexual assault. And we have a lot of folks who are confused or not sure if that's what they experience because what we see in TV and movies does look a lot different than what occurs in real life. So less than 1% of sexual assault cases require more than minor first aid. So that really does reflect what sexual assault typically does look like for folks and how we see that normally done. Okay, perfect. I am going to be passing it off to Mary.
Alrighty, thanks, Kira. So we are just gonna kind of shift this conversation to talking about child sexual abuse. So we do have a definition of child sexual abuse, which we have from our Who Do You Tell program, which has been present over 25 years. There is a more legislated definition from the Child Youth and Family Enhancement Act, but it is somewhat ambiguous on purpose. That is why we do offer this definition that provides a more focus on the actions that are involved. So when we are defining child sexual abuse, it is when an adult or an older teen looks at or touches the private parts of a child's body or asks the child to look at or touch their private parts. It can also include an adult or an older teen showing a child sexual images or speaking to a child using sexual language. When we are looking at the definition of a child under a criminal code, a child is anyone under the age of 18. And that is why in some cases it might get really blurry for teenagers because they are in that weird transition between like a child and an adult. And that is why there are things in the law that actually help us determine whether something that happens between teenagers or youth would be considered as child sexual abuse or would be considered as peer-on-peer sexual assault. And one of the biggest things that help us with that is, oh, doesn't move. Sorry, folks, is our ages of consent or closing age exemptions. So in Canada, the legal age of consent is 16, which is when they can consent to having those relationships or sexual activity with folks. But our law does recognize that youth between the ages of 12 to 16 are engaging in those relationships and are potentially also engaging in sexual activity. And that is why they created the closing age exemptions to provide more protection to younger folks against people who might abuse the power and control that they have over them. So when we are looking at the closing age exemptions, we can see that anyone under the age of 12 cannot consent to any sexual activity, even if they agree to it. It is just completely illegal for anyone under 12. For folks who are between the ages of 12 to 13, they are able to consent with anyone who is less than 2 years older than them. So this is actually when exact birthdays come into play because that is how the law measures exact age, and that becomes really important in certain situations. So for example, someone who turned 12 today cannot consent to sexual activity with someone who turned 14 last week, because that would be 2 years and a week of an age gap, which is not within the allowed time range. Similarly, for folks between the age of 14 to 15, they are able to consent with anyone who is less than 5 years older than them. And again, this is when exact birthdays become really important. And I know it could be really tricky to remember within 2 years or within 5 years. So a really helpful tool that we like to mention is for folks between 12 to 13, it's 2 years minus 1 day. And for folks between 14 to 15, it's 5 years minus 1 day. Now, once our youth reaches the age of 16, which is the legal age of consent in Canada, then they are able to consent with anyone over the age of 14, unless that person is in a position of trust or authority. So folks like their parents, their guardians, any older relatives, their teachers, their bosses, their doctors, law enforcement, faith leaders, all of those people are people who would have positions of trust, authority, or dependency over that child. And so that would be someone that they cannot legally consent to. And we know that the closing age exemptions can be hard to wrap around our heads on. So we did create a chart at CASA that we use to better understand who are people that young people can actually consent to. So with this chart, we look at the person's age on one end and the other person's age on the top, where those ages meet. When we see a check mark, that means they can legally consent to that relationship or that sexual activity. If we see a red X there, then that means no legal consent can be given in that situation. And if we see a yellow circle, that means those exact birthdays would come into play and we it really depends on their birthdays whether that is something that they can legally consent to or not. But when we are talking about the closing age exemptions and how it helps us determine child sexual abuse or peer-on-peer sexual assault, what we are talking about is that if something happens, or if sexual violence happens between two young people and it is within the close-in age exemptions or those ranges that I just talked about, that would be considered as peer-to-peer sexual assault. But if it falls outside of the close-in age exemptions, then that would be considered as child sexual abuse. And we will be looking at how that would look like in terms of reporting in the latter part of this presentation. But shifting this conversation to looking at the roots of sexual violence here. So this is what we call the pyramid of sexual violence. And it really allows us to understand why sexual violence still happens in our communities and it continues to persist. Um, and it, although it's shaped as a pyramid, it does not show a hierarchy of impact again, meaning the ones on top of the pyramid are more hurtful or more impactful than the other ones below. That is not the case. All of these things in each level of the pyramid hold their own impact, hold their own weight, are harmful in their own ways. And it's really up to the people who experience sexual violence to make sense of those impacts. But what this shows us is the progression of someone from the bottom of the pyramid all the way to the top. So when sexual violence happens, it's not something that happens overnight. People don't wake up one day and decide that it's good. It's a good thing to engage in sexual violence that day. They go through a whole lifetime of experiences and they get exposed to many different things as they grow older, which eventually influences their decision to engage in sexual violence. So it is a choice when someone engages in sexual violence. But it all starts with those attitudes and beliefs that are placed at the very bottom of our pyramid, which serve as our foundation. So we are all exposed to those attitudes and beliefs, and they influence how we see ourselves, how we see other people, how we treat ourselves, how we treat other people as well. And unfortunately, they're not always positive. Right? These attitudes and beliefs sometimes can be discriminatory in nature and they come in the form of isms. So the isms that we know, like racism, sexism, ableism, ageism, all those things are actually systemic and discriminatory in nature, which means that they influence how our society functions. So they give one group of people in society more power and control over another group of people. And when people internalize that and they think that they should have more power and control in situations or that they do have more power and control, that is when sexual violence can potentially start. When people start acting on those harmful attitudes and beliefs and they disregard someone's consent, cross their boundaries, disrespect their consent and boundaries, that is when sexual violence starts. So when they start acting on those attitudes and beliefs and express them verbally through sexual harassment, sexualizing people, making jokes or compliments that are not really compliments and jokes, then that is a verbal expression of sexual violence. And those are those attitudes and beliefs in action. When people are not being challenged for verbal expressions of sexual violence, they might think that it's okay to engage in them. And that is when they might engage in more physical expressions of sexual violence through sexual assault or sexual abuse. We also place suicide and homicide at the very top of our pyramid because we do believe that it is the last form of violence that could potentially result from sexual violence. When someone ends up taking someone else's life when they engage in sexual violence, or someone experiences sexual violence and thinks that the only way out of that experience is to take their own life, that is the last form of violence that can happen as a result of sexual violence, and there's no going back from there, unfortunately. Um, but really, when we are looking at the pyramid, when someone reaches the very top of the pyramid, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be stuck there forever. There are ways to move down the pyramid of sexual violence, and that is when we are being accountable for our actions and the harm that we have done. And people are also challenging those behaviors as well. So when someone is being challenged and someone is calling them out for their harmful behaviors and they actually take accountability for that, they apologize for whatever they have done, and they actively try to unlearn the harmful attitude and belief and change that behavior, then they are on their way to the bottom of the pyramid. But really, what the roots of sexual violence and the sexual violence pyramid tells us is how those things are rooted in the way our society functions, and it does help us make sense of why some people are disproportionately affected by sexual violence in society. But that being said, that does not mean that people who are in those groups that have less power and control in society are targeted. It just helps us understand why that is the case. Okay. But those are the roots of sexual violence, which kind of leads us to our myths and facts about sexual violence. So in the next bit here, we are going to be talking about some facts about sexual violence. We're going to go over some misconceptions. And if before this session, you thought that something was a fact, but it ends up being a myth. There is no judgment in that. The reason why we are sharing these facts is so we can replace those misconceptions with facts and that we can share that with our connections as well. So the first myth is that sexual violence, like sexual assault or child sexual abuse, rarely occurs. So a lot of times people might think that it's not a common experience, but we know for a fact that just in Alberta alone, 45% of adult Albertans have experienced certain forms of sexual violence in their lifetime. And additionally, 17% of adult men and 41% of adult women have experienced sexual assault. When we are also looking at child sexual abuse, we know that 1/3 of the population of children in Alberta have experienced child sexual abuse. So when we are looking at the total population of Alberta, that's 34% of children, which is about 325,000 children who have experienced child sexual abuse in our province. So we can really see that with the numbers, how serious and how common sexual violence is, and how maybe in our everyday walk or in our everyday lives, there is someone that we are encountering that have experienced sexual violence. And so talking about this today and learning how to support those experiences would be really, really helpful given the magnitude of sexual violence and how much it occurs in our society. The next myth is that people who experience sexual violence rarely knows the person who chose to use sexual violence. That is, again, a myth or a misconception because we know that most sexual assaults are actually committed by someone that the person knows. And in fact, that's 87% of the time. It can include their friends, their partners, their acquaintances, family members. And when we are looking at child sexual abuse, it's also true, but this time it's 88% of the time children know the person who is harming them or using sexual abuse against them. And so this kind of debunks stranger danger that we have been taught while growing up, right? Obviously, it is still something that could happen. Sexual violence can still be used by strangers. But when we are looking at the numbers, there are far greater numbers of people who have been impacted by sexual violence who knows the person who used it against them. But yeah, so that is just another misconception that we are trying to debunk. The next one is that people lie about being sexually assaulted. So false reports of sexual assault occur about 2 to 8% of the time, which is actually the same as false reporting rates for any other crime. So the rates for false reports for sexual assault is the same as break and enter or theft, right? Children also very rarely lie about child sexual abuse. And if they do lie, it's typically to say that nothing occurred when it in fact did. So when children lie, it's mostly to take it back because they are now seeing the consequences of sharing that experience. And the last myth is that physical harm is often used in sexual assault or child sexual abuse. Kira kind of briefly talked about this a while ago, but the majority of sexual assaults result in no or little physical injury, which, as she said, it's less than 1% of the time. Physical force is also rarely used in child sexual abuse because typically there's manipulation there, there's grooming, and threats are used, which really means that extensive physical force is not needed in those situations. And it's just a lot of like manipulation that is involved in that one. But those are some of the misconceptions and replacing them with facts about sexual violence. And I'm going to turn it over to Kira to talk about that more.
Thank you, Mary. So, as we talk about children specifically in terms of child sexual abuse, there's a lot of different reasons why children often do not disclose until adulthood. And we'll kind of go through those a little bit now just to get a bit of a better understanding as to why a child might not disclose. So children might not identify that what is being done to them is abusive. And that can be for a variety of reasons. It can be that, again, the person who's causing them harm has that relationship of trust and unfortunately is manipulating and exploiting that. And they might just simply tell the child, like, oh, this is our special game or special touch or something of the sort. And yeah, or the child might just not understand that that's not okay or that an adult or an older teen shouldn't be doing that to them. Children also just might not have the vocabulary to name what's being done to them, which kind of goes hand in hand with what I just mentioned. But it can also really just be that the child's like, I don't think this is okay, but I don't know what this is. I don't know how to explain this to someone. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how to name it. And I think Mary mentioned our Who Do You Tell program a bit earlier, but that's part of having that early education is being able to give children the vocabulary to name something that's being done to them. Another piece is that children might just feel uncomfortable, embarrassed, or ashamed to describe what's being done to them. And that could be for a variety of reasons. It could be that the individual who's causing them harm is telling them that they should be ashamed or that they should be uncomfortable or embarrassed to tell someone. They might even be putting some blame on the child, which of course we all know is not okay. But as a child or youth, you really are like, oh my gosh, people are going to blame me or think that this is something that I asked for and that's embarrassing, right? And while we know that that's not true, a child and a youth might not know that, especially if that person is manipulating them. And frankly, it can be uncomfortable and embarrassing to talk about that sort of thing. And especially for children and youth, some of them might feel very uncomfortable talking about things like private parts. And so discussing something that's being done to them can be really difficult as well. Another piece is that children might just simply not want to burden those they care about by telling them that something bad is happening. And I know a lot of us in the Zoom room right now are probably who have children in our lives are probably like, no, like that would never be a burden. I want them to be able to come to me. And that is so true. But again, children are really just innately so loving and caring and for the older adults in their lives that they love and trust. They just don't want them to be upset too if it's something that's happening that is upsetting and hurtful for them and they know that it's going to be upsetting for someone that they love to hear about. They might just not want to put that on them. And another piece can really just be that children might not want to tell because they love and trust the person that's causing them harm and they don't want that person to get in trouble. And I think sometimes this can be a difficult one for us to unpack, but really just understanding two things can exist at once. A child can have a loving and trusting relationship with an adult and not like what that adult is doing and not be okay with that. Maybe they just want that behavior to stop. They don't want to lose that person. And while that can sometimes be difficult for us to understand, it is important that we hold that understanding and we hold space for children and youth in that aspect because that is a very difficult thing. And yeah, that can definitely be a barrier for children not disclosing. While we're talking about disclosures for children, when we talk about how children tell someone that they've been experiencing child sexual abuse, it is not as linear of a narrative, and it might not be that they just go right up to a trusted adult in their life and say, "Hi, I'm experiencing child sexual abuse," right? That's simply not really the case, though of course that would make it a bit easier. So we'll explore some of the ways that children might go about telling people that they've experienced child sexual abuse. So children try different ways of talking about it. So it might even be a scenario question. What would happen if someone did this to me, right? And then of course someone might be like, "Oh my gosh, is that happening?" And the child might be like, "No, just was wondering." Might just kind of be their way of testing the waters, right? Another piece might be that they use like a friend scenario. Like, what would happen if my friend so and so was experiencing this from this person? And that can really just be, like I said, their way to test the waters and see what the reaction might be if they do share that. And even for them to gauge, like, if it is something that's inappropriate, right? Another piece is that it can also just be that they don't really know how to name it. So they are just trying those other ways to talk about it. They might even just say, "I don't like that person anymore. I don't want to go to that person's house anymore." And that can be their way of kind of disclosing that something's going on. Children tell a little at a time. Now, depending on the age of the child, this can also just be like developmentally their narrative too. If you try and listen to like a 5-year-old tell you about how their day was, it's all over the place. You don't even know if you're talking about the same thing. And that can be a big piece of disclosing. A child can maybe drop a little piece here, and then somewhere else later on in that conversation or a different conversation, and that can be because of that developmental narrative that children have at the time. Or it can also be that that has become their narrative from the trauma they've experienced. So, what we do know with the way that trauma impacts our brains, especially the brains of children and youth, can be that that is the way that they are sharing, is that it's just kind of disconjoined and it's not really like a linear narrative. But again, that partly is the way that just their narratives go because they are children and that's where they are developmentally, but it can also be compounded by trauma. Another piece with children telling a little at a time, that can also be their way of testing the waters again. Trying to drop little pieces here and there just to kind of see what the reaction is, see what gets a big reaction, see what doesn't, and then therefore they'll kind of see if they can share more or not. Another piece is that children might take it back, and this can be very confusing for folks. So allow me to explain a little bit more. Children might take it back for a variety of reasons. Again, maybe they love and trust the person who's causing them harm. They disclose to someone and then suddenly they can't see that person anymore. Or they know that that person is now in trouble and they don't want them to be in trouble, or they want to be able to see them again. They don't want to lose that person out of their lives. So they might take back their disclosure to just try and still be able to have connection with that person. Like I said, that can be a confusing concept, but it is just important to note that it really does come from that place of there is a loving and trusting relationship that's being exploited. And we know that's okay, but that can be a very difficult thing for a child to try and understand. Another piece could be that maybe the reaction that a child got when they disclosed was really overwhelming and upsetting for them and made them feel like they did something wrong. Like I mentioned, children really do care about our feelings, and they're very perceptive to them. So if a child discloses to us and we immediately start just like uncontrollably crying or we're very angry, even if those reactions aren't directed at the child, the child is noting that what they shared with us caused us to react that way. And that can be tough. And again, we're not robots. If a child discloses to us, of course, we're probably going to have emotion. We're probably going to feel angry or sad or upset inside. But again, really just trying to focus on not necessarily showing that emotion. But if we do, just letting them know, I'm not crying because you told me I'm crying because I'm sad that someone hurt you. And I'm truly just so glad you told me. Just being able to provide that supportive response. Next, and this one is hard for parents in the room, especially. Children often don't tell their parents first. It's not because they don't love and trust their parents. It's typically because they will tell what we refer to as like a lower risk trusted adult, who is just someone who does have that good supportive relationship with the child. The child does love them and trust them, but it's just not as high stakes as telling someone like child's parents, right? So it's kind of another way to test the waters a little bit, but to also just kind of see what the reaction is. Maybe they want help telling their parents. Children usually have a loving, trusting relationship with their parents and don't want to hurt them. So again, that's where we can see them not telling their parents first. And then in some cases, of course, unfortunately, it might be a parent or someone close to a parent that is causing harm. So that can also impact if a child does or doesn't tell their parent first. But this is something we can normalize for parents because a lot of the time parents will feel like, am I a bad parent? They didn't come to me first. No, it's likely because they just wanted to protect you. And that is a very sweet thing, even though, of course, it's a very difficult situation. All right, I'll pass it back over to Mary.
Alrighty, so we're now going to switch gears here a bit and look at what reporting can look like for sexual assault, for sexual harassment, and for child sexual abuse, because that would look different for each of those things, and it generally reporting would look very different for everyone. Okay, but starting us off here with reporting instances of sexual assault. So with sexual assault, there is no obligation to report it in Canada if it takes place between two adults. Reporting is always the choice of the person who was assaulted. There is also no statute of limitations on reporting in Canada. So someone who has experienced sexual assault can report 10 years, 20 years, 50 years down the road. They are still able to do that. However, something to note is that does not guarantee action will be taken, especially for more historic experiences that are being reported. If police or like an investigation doesn't have anything to go off of, then unfortunately that action might not be taken there. And another thing to note is that if someone is reporting a historic experience, whatever happened will follow the loss during the time that the assault happened. So if anything happens be like between the year between a certain period and the laws were different than it is now, then it will follow the rules during that time. In terms of sexual assault, there is the duty to report. So every adult in Alberta with reasonable suspicions of child abuse or neglect is obligated to report to Children's Services, but I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next few slides here. When we are talking about sexual harassment, on the other hand, there's a difference between disclosing or reporting. So when we are talking about disclosing, it's just sharing that information to someone to get that support, or but there is no formal report that is happening. So when it comes to sexual harassment, when it comes to disclosing, there is that interpersonal resolution. So maybe sharing it with a friend, or if it happened at work, you can share it with someone to get that support that you deserve. But if it does happen at work, you can also talk to HR or human resources in the workplace. But that process might look very different for everyone, depending on policies and whatever that are in place in each workplace. But if someone also needs to take some time off, they are able to disclose that to Workers' Compensation Board to get compensated for any missed time or working time if it happened in the workplace. Um, as for reporting, as we mentioned a while ago, sexual harassment is not in the criminal code, so it is not something that we can charge for, but there are ways to report it. If it does happen to someone at a workplace, they're able to report that to Occupational Health and Safety, or OHS, or the Alberta Human Rights Commission as well. And it becomes criminal harassment and stalking, and that is something that we can report to the police. But as Kira also mentioned a while ago, in Calgary specifically, but we're not too sure which other cities in Canada would have it. So it's really good to just check whether your city has a bylaw similar to Calgary's on harassment and reporting that harassment to the city of Calgary or the government, so that person can be fined for whatever behavior that they did. As for reporting child sexual abuse, like I said, every adult in Alberta, so that's anyone 18 and above, has the duty to report concerns of child abuse to Alberta Children's Services, and that would include child sexual abuse as well as neglect. And so when it comes to reporting to Alberta Children's Services, it might look different for each workplace if you do work with youth. So it is best to also check in with your supervisor. But we do have that duty to report reasonable suspicions of child abuse. So if you remember when we were talking about the closing age exemptions a while ago, if something happens between two young folks and their ages fall within the closing age exemptions, then that would be considered as peer-to-peer sexual assault, and that is something that we don't have to report to Children's Services. But if it is something that happens outside of the closing age exemptions, then that is something that we are obligated to report to Alberta Children's Services. However, or although reporting to Children's Services is an obligation, reporting to the police is not. It is a choice for older folks. It is their choice that they can make for themselves. Or sorry, for child sexual abuse, it is something that they can choose with their family, or their family chooses for them. But something to note when it comes to reporting to the police and child sexual abuse, if a report is made to Alberta Children's Services, sometimes there might be situations where they would involve police as well. Okay, but that is what reporting looks like for sexual assault, sexual harassment, and child sexual abuse. So just kind of briefly going over impacts, just for the sake of time here. When we are looking at impacts, we know that there are many different impacts, like psychological, physical, or relational, or social, spiritual, behavioral, and emotional. And a lot of times these impacts actually overlap. Kira, do you have any examples of like impacts that we can think of?
Yeah, for sure. This has been one that's come up quite a bit for psychological and physical, kind of together. Eating disorders, child sexual abuse is actually there's a pretty significant, I would say, correlation between the two. I think it's 30% of ED cases note that they experience child sexual abuse. But again, we also know that's underreported, so we can actually assume it's higher, but that still is a significant enough of a correlation to kind of note as well. And another thing in terms of like psychological can be things like anxiety, depression, anything like that. And even with physical, I think, and Mary, I don't think I have the stat for it right now. I don't know if you do, but there is a connection between things like IBS and having experienced like child sexual abuse or even just sexual violence throughout life. And we can kind of see how psychological and physical a lot of the time can go hand in hand, right? Because for anxiety, depression, they can have some physical impacts as well. Yeah, and moving
Mhm.
forward to, I think, social and relational, it really depends on the person. Some people might find comfort in engaging with friends more, and some people might have a little bit more of that withdrawal, or psychological impacts can tie in there as well, for sure.
Mhm. Absolutely. Thanks, Kira. But yeah, so really impacts, they can overlap sometimes. Something that might appear more psychological can appear in relational or behavioral or emotional. But something that we always like to note when we are talking about impacts is that oftentimes as outsiders, we always look for impacts that may look negative from an outsider perspective. And oftentimes we overlook things that might look positive because we think that, oh, they're thriving, they're doing okay. An example of this could be for physical, someone who probably did not go to the gym before is now going to the gym, taking care of their body after experiencing sexual violence. Or maybe someone is now more wanting to be connected to their friends or their family, so they're now more social and actually valuing those relationships that they have. Someone who experienced sexual violence who was not very spiritual before might now lean more into their religion or their spirituality. And those things are what we would normally see as more positive things, but they are still impacts. Not to say that sexual violence is positive in any way, but there are impacts that may look positive to an outsider, but there are still impacts that show up with folks who have experienced sexual violence in the past. Kira, did you want to add something?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's such an important thing to note because a lot of the time, especially when it comes to children and youth, we look for these like very
Mm,
dark and stark shifts, right? We look for
mhm,
these really negative impacts. But then if a child starts thriving in school, we don't second guess it.
mhm,
Don't think that there's something that could be a root cause of that. If they start engaging more socially, we don't think that there can be something sinister occurring or has occurred to lead to that. So it just is an important thing to note because some people might be
mm,
like, well, I had no idea there was nothing that I saw that
yeah.
was a negative change, right? So
Mhm.
it is just a very interesting concept for sure.
There are some people think there are no tell signs, so did not happen. But yeah, impacts could look very different for folks. It can look negative or positive. It is in like a spectrum of impacts for sure. Um, but with that, switching gears here again and talking about support, we all have the ability to support. And with effective support, people are actually able to heal. Healing obviously is not linear, but it is possible with folks receiving effective support from people around them, from different services that are available in the community as well. So when we are talking about support, these are some of the key messages that we would love to share with folks for when you are supporting an adult who have experienced sexual assault or sexual harassment. Um, and these are some of our key messages. They are just guiding messages that you can use when you are supporting someone. You don't have to use them word for word. I actually don't like using them word for word because it gets really robotic and not so genuine when you are using it word for word. You can use your own language, and we do encourage that. And you can also use your body language to convey these messages as well. So I believe you really just holding that person's story as the truth and not questioning what they are telling you. It's not your fault. Some people might think that they are responsible for what happened to them, but we know that the only person who is responsible for sexual violence happening is the person who is choosing to do it. So reminding them that it was not their fault, they were not responsible for whatever they have experienced is really impactful for folks that we are supporting as well. Your feelings are valid. A lot of times people might feel a gazillion emotions all at once, and sometimes they might not feel anything. But all of those emotions, all of those feelings are valid because all of those reactions are normal reactions to an abnormal experience like sexual violence. We also want to remind them that their needs come first. Sometimes we hear from adults that we support wanting to report because that can stop that person from harming another individual. Although that is valid for a lot of people, um, we also want to remind them that whatever they need in that moment is what comes first. And with when it comes to needs, we want to make sure that we are always asking them and never assuming that they would like to be supported a certain way. And lastly is I support your decisions. So we might have our own opinions on how to move forward with an experience, but the people that we are supporting do not need to know that. We are supporters, and our main job is to just be there for that person and support whatever decisions they make, whatever choice they make moving forward. When it comes to sexual violence, a lot of power and control is being taken away from folks. And so having that ability to choose for themselves can give them back that power and control that they lost. And this is pretty much the same for when we are supporting disclosures with children and youth. But we focus on the main three on here, which is I believe you. A lot of times children might think that they will, or fear that they might not be believed when they disclose an experience of child sexual abuse. And so really just conveying that we believe them, not questioning their story. And it might be really hard if we know the person who is harming the child personally, to be, and we might go into a defense mode. But remember that we're not questioning that child's story and we are believing them. It's not your fault. Again, they might feel a lot of shame and guilt for experiencing that, and they might think that they did something wrong. That's why that happened to them. So just reminding them that it was not their responsibility and it was not their fault that happened to them. And again, your feelings are normal. Children might feel so many things, and there's also probably a lot of confusion there, especially when the person who is harming them is someone that is close to them and someone that they love. But again, all of the feelings, all of the emotions that they are feeling in that moment are valid. And we want to hold space for those feelings and normalize those feelings for that child or for that youth. But another support that we have in the community is our organization, CASA. So CASA, or Calgary Communities Against Sexual Abuse, is the main sexual assault center for Calgary and surrounding areas. And we do offer a variety of clinical services for folks who have experienced sexual violence in the past or more recently. We do have our support and information line for folks who are needing that support or that information about sexual violence. People who have experienced sexual violence can call the line. People who are supporting another person can call the line. Professionals who have more specific questions can also call the line. It's open from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. every single day of the year, including holidays. We also have our public education and community outreach, which is what Kira and I are a part of. So we go to communities, we do webinars like this to really educate our community and to spread awareness about the topic of sexual violence and how we can best support people who have experienced it. We also have our police and court education and support, which is the program that supports anyone who has experienced sexual violence with navigating the legal system or even just thinking about it. They're not lawyers, they won't give legal advice, but they do provide that extra advocacy for folks who are in the legal system. We also support the Calgary Sexual Assault Response Team, which is a team of doctors, nurses, and CASA staff that provide support for anyone who has experienced sexual assault in the last 7 days. So they do provide medical attention and emotional support for folks, and they also give them options moving forward. With Sexual Assault Response Team here in Calgary, the main access point is the Sheldon Shamir Urgent Care Center in downtown, but this team can also go to other emergency departments across the city. We also offer individual and group counseling for folks. We offer it through Zoom, through phone calls or in person, and we offer up to 24 free and confidential sessions and 6 sessions for support people. We also have our integrated case management, which is a pilot project for folks who are 15 years and older, who have experienced sexual violence, but are also dealing with complex needs. So with our integrated case management, they help people with resource navigation, stabilization, psychoeducation, provide advocacy for clients as well, and they make sure that they are ready to access therapy or counseling. So they deal with all that before the client even goes into the counseling part of CASA. And lastly, our volunteer engagement. Our volunteers are lovely. They help us support the line after hours and other opportunities outside of CASA. When it comes to referral, I'm just going to breeze through all of these ones. At CASA, we do encourage self-referral for folks. We do need to talk to the client to know that they are really consenting to accessing CASA services. With that, they would call the support and information line and book an intake assessment with us. And within that intake assessment, they would be asked questions about their experiences, and CASA would then make that assessment if this person is ready to access CASA services or if they are a fit for CASA. We also offer consultation for professionals. So if a professional is wanting to ask specific questions about a client or about services, they are able to call the line. We do recommend that they call the line from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. on weekdays because that would lead to our CASA office. And we do encourage them to ask for a counseling supervisor who can provide specific answers to their questions as well. And lastly, we do ensure client safety and stabilization when it comes to our clients and the people that we support in the community. And this is more related to our ICM or integrated case management. They really make sure that folks are ready for therapy because that is also a very long process and overwhelming process sometimes for folks. So they are wanting to make sure that clients are ready for that. But that brings us to our survey. And sorry, Kira, do we want to do this now or do I want to move on? Okay, so I'll leave this survey link for CASA for about 10 seconds for folks to be able to scan it. And then we'll move on into our question and answer portion. Alrighty. Okay, I will move on to the next slide, but if folks are needing me to stay on the survey slide, please feel free to let us know through the question and answer feature. But alrighty, so thank you everyone for joining us today, but these are just the numbers to share with you folks. The Calgary or CASA supported information line is the first number on there. Like I said, anyone can call the line. Professionals, people who are needing support people, it is available to anyone 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. every single day. We also support the Alberta One Line for Sexual Violence through the Association of Alberta Sexual Assault Services, and they do have a call or text feature to it for folks who are more comfortable doing that rather than talking to someone on the phone. And we also have the 24-hour sexual violence support line, which is not affiliated with CASA or ASAS, but it is a good resource for folks they need any support anytime within the day. But that is everything for folks, and we can now move on to our question and answer, I guess.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for such an amazing talk and sharing your important work with all of us. I know I say that on behalf of myself and all of the AVA team, so thank you very much. And for those of you who are still here, we do have a survey. The link is up on screen for you briefly. It's also in the chat if you would take the survey also about our webinar and the experience you had here today. I know that we'll give some time for the people who are in attendance to put some questions in the Q&A box, but I had one for you if you wouldn't mind. I know a lot of my students, for example, are very interested in going into this line of work, but worry kind of about the personal and professional toll doing heavy work might take. Do you have recommendations for people in terms of like wellness or self-care that helps you do this important work?
I feel like it really depends on like what works best for people, but I always like having a good counselor I can go to in my back pocket, to kind of be able to unpack stuff and impacts. Because it's interesting, there are certain things that we talk about sometimes where it's like, I feel like that should impact me more. And then there's other stuff where it's like, why is that impacting me? And being able to have such a supportive, even work environment is so, so beneficial. But sometimes you also want to be able to talk about that on a more like intimate, personal level. And so having an awesome counselor is a really good step for that. And I think also just finding what works for you for self-care. There are certain training days where it's like, I'm not cooking supper when I get home. I am gonna order in, or maybe I need to go do some type of activity after work, right? So I think just finding those little things that works for you and being able to have like your own supportive network as well, I think is super, super good. And that's kind of mainly what I do.
Mhm. Just to add on what Kira said, yeah, it really depends on the person and what works best for them. We are fortunate to have a really supportive team here at CASA, and we are able to debrief with them if something goes on in our sessions, and we know that we are going to be supported after that. I think what works for me is having those clear boundaries with work and life as well, and just knowing when to detach from the work that I do and really take a step back and take care of myself, especially when things get really overwhelming with the work, because it can get really difficult sometimes. But having those clear boundaries with yourself and with your work, I think would help you just take care of yourself more because you know what's your limit. And yeah, just knowing what works for you in terms of self-care, even if it's just curious example, not cooking supper during that day, or maybe going for a walk. It really looks different for everyone. So just having self-awareness, I guess, in terms of self-care could also really help.
Absolutely. I think that's a lesson we can all learn about day-to-day life, but especially important in careers such as yours.
Mm.
Does the audience have any questions? Or do you two have things you didn't get a chance to really talk about that you'd like to share?
I don't think so, no.
Yeah,
It was such an informative presentation.
Thank you.
thanks.
All right, well, since no questions are coming in, let's go ahead and wrap up. Thank you all for attending. Please remember to take both of the surveys that were shared with you, and if the two of you could stay on the line, that would be great. All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.